bite to eat. As you can see, we're all set for our next panel, where we are going to be talking about covering migration. So let me introduce you to Magda. Magda Abu Fadil is the Director of Media Unlimited. She's also been at Agence France Presse, United Press International, and Defense News, and has done a lot of work around defense and security. So she's going to lead this panel. We've got 30 minutes. We've got a lot to cover, and we know it's a very passionate subject. So Magda, I shall leave you to it. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Jody. Today, we're going to be discussing the issue of migration and how to cover it. It's a very complex topic, and it's very hot. It's very controversial. And quite often, journalists get it wrong, either intentionally or unintentionally. And we have to be fair, we have to be balanced. I won't use the word objective because that in itself can be subjective. So the subject of migration doesn't just include migration, it includes refugees and human trafficking, and one could lead to the other. And so what guidelines do we have? Are there any guidelines? Are there ethics behind it? We're going to discuss all of that with our panelists, but let me show you some of what I mean. This is a small video produced by the UNHCR, one of the countless organizations that deals with refugees and migrants and people who go from one country to another, who've lost their homes, who find themselves in very difficult situations. The facts and figures they produce are what they find from their research, and sometimes it can be skewed for whatever reason, on purpose or not. And sometimes governments disagree with these NGOs and international organizations, and therein lies the problem. Because when you have divergence, and then how do you cover the story? And journalists can be misled, and they can be very confused, and that creates a big problem when you're trying to cover the story fairly. So media need help in sorting out all this information, and some of it can be very fuzzy. For example, the terminology that's used. Who's a migrant? Who's a refugee? Who's a displaced person? Internally displaced person? I mean, there are all sorts of terms that you know, you have to understand and deal with. So to help journalists, I was commissioned to write this guide by the Thomson Foundation's Open Media Hub and the International Center for Migration Policy Development. And it was translated to Arabic and French, and this is where you can download it, and it's quite handy. Then Open Media Hub asked me to turn it into workshops, and I trained journalists in Tunis on how to cover the topic, and I'll be doing more training in Armenia next month. And Open Media Hub and ICMPD, with European Union funding, also launched the Migration Media Award, and I'm a member of the jury of that award. I have been for the last 3 years. Last but not least, OMH asked me to create an online course based on that handbook for journalists and anyone who may be interested. It's self-paced, it's free, and it's available in 4 languages: English, Arabic, French, and Russian. No, I don't speak Russian, but the other 3 I do. Okay, now let's turn to our distinguished panelists. First, we have Omoyele Sowore. He is the founder and editor of Sahara reporters, and he has been very instrumental in trying to uncover wrongdoing in his native Nigeria. He also ran for president, which I think is suicidal for anyone to try to do that. And he's an advocate for justice, equality, security, democracy, very important topics. And Omoyele, you started a project that's quite unusual maybe and very interesting in Nigeria and in Africa. Please tell us about it.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Here's the clicker.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's a very difficult time of the day to have a panel. Everybody just ate. But gladly, you have a very comfortable seat so you can fall asleep if we bore you in any way. But I am here to just have a little conversation with you about how we cover migration, especially now that migration has become a hot topic in Europe and America, where far-right politics is driving the conversation around migration. And it's also somehow forcing coverage to follow along those lines. So it's become so binary that when you talk about migration out of Africa in particular, you are not looking at airplanes, you are looking at boats, that are taking people from Libya to Italy or somewhere else. And this has always been conversations that are driven by other sentiments. Sometimes some of them are very, very racist, in the way we cover these issues. We just look at it and see a bunch of people trying to run away from their continent without understanding that there's been the subject of immigration or migration generally has not always been this way. As a matter of fact, the first set of people that migrated out of wherever they were migrated towards Africa, starting from 1884, when in Germany there was a discussion around how to partition Africa amongst Europeans, and they did not even go for visas in those times. They just went on boats and partitioned and took over different parts of Africa. The Portuguese, British, the Italians, everybody, that had a boat went to Africa. But today, when we are discussing migration, we completely forget the history of migration that it started from here towards Africa. But today, I'm here to give a different perspective to it, that migration is not also something that, or, the attendant issues of migration is not something that have to do with Europe alone. In South Africa, when we visited a few years ago, we discovered that South Africans are more hostile towards other African migrants than they are. Than some European countries. And this is some documentary we did in South Africa, how South Africans were beating up Nigerians in South Africa because they see them as economic parasites in their country. But you know what? We have to look at this from the point of data. And what we have here is that African immigrants in the US pay over $22.2 billion in taxes. But beyond that, these migrants are also helping their countries.
Yes.
In Nigeria, more money is coming from people who migrated from Nigeria to different parts of Europe and America than we're getting from oil, from remittances. Yes. So migrants are actually remitting more money to their home countries than all of the European and North American countries concerned with regards to aid.
Is that what you're doing from the U.S.?
Yes, well, I do that through Western Union all the time. Okay. And it's also to understand that migrants carry weight to their destination countries. Yeah. They help. They do great things. They have breakthroughs, both scientific, in arts, and they take whatever they have with them. And you all know that people like Steve Jobs, the guy who founded Apple, their parents they migrated, from different parts of the world. In fact, some of the biggest businesses in the U.S. are, owned by offsprings of migrants or even migrants directly. And sometimes we forget, wherever we might find ourselves, in Europe and America, that we are migrants ourselves. I migrated to the U.S. some 20 years ago, founded a news website that has almost completely changed the direction of news reporting in Nigeria, called Sahara Reporters. So many people did that. And Sahara Reporters was able to do what it's doing because I had a safe haven in the U.S. and used that place to launch an attack on bad governance at home in Nigeria, corruption. And we broke in several stories. I personally wrote over 5,000 stories until I got tired about a year ago and decided to do what she called suicide. I wanted to go and run for the president of Nigeria so that we can, and the first thing I was confronted when I visited Italy. I was like, oh, when are you going to stop sending your migrants to us?
Wow.
Well, I said, when I become president, not only will I stop migration towards you, I will stop you people from migrating towards us too, so that you understand how bad it feels when you just scandalize people simply because they are confronted with the need to move. And human beings must move all the time. So our solution, which is something we did with Jen in Ivory Coast recently, we won an award when this was presented by our team in Ivory Coast through a Jen event, is that we must start to take ownership of the narrative about migration and not to make migration look like it's a crime. You know, we must look at it within the context of global politics and the new world order, that when people are moving, they're not just moving because they love to move. There are reasons why they move.
Sure.
And every story that's covering migration must take into consideration that context as to why people move, why there's dislocation, and why we have all of the issues around migration now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Amayeli. Okay, now we turn to our other speaker, Blanca Tapia, who's the program manager of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Initially, some of you who have the printed program will see the name of Hannah Storm from the Ethical Journalism Network, of which I'm a member, and unfortunately Hannah couldn't join us. She apologizes, but she had an emergency, so Blanca very kindly agreed to substitute for her, and she's going to tell us a bit about her program. She's the program manager of FRA, EU FRA. Tell us what you do and why it's important and what impact it has.
Well, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights is actually part of the EU.
Can you talk in the mic, please?
Yes, most of you might know Frontex, EASO, the European Asylum Office, might not have heard about my small agency, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, which is fundamental rights is human rights, but EU context, because we have a Charter of Fundamental Rights. Let's say it's more rights than the ones that are just in human rights. And I take actually what you have said about the importance of words. People talk about economic migrant. I could be myself an economic migrant. I come from Spain. I took a job at the EU. I ended up in Vienna. But I belong to a fantastic category called expats. It looks good. It's much better than economic migrant. And then what we know is that this use of words, when we talk about migration, is something that we've been looking into, not just my agency, but also other international organizations like the UNHCR that you put out there, and how important it is how we use the words, and how important it is also how we, in public information, report and inform about numbers. It's not numbers, it's people what we're talking about. And each number has a person, has a history, is a human being. So going to that, the work of my agency is to really make sure that the human rights of people in the EU are taken into consideration. And I'm talking about people, and here I'm not talking about, I'm not putting labels here. Everybody who is in the EU as a human, as a person, has rights, and those rights need to be respected. And the situation right now is that they're not. So the fundamental rights of those third country nationals, could be you, Nigerians, that are staying in the EU are not respected, and we are telling this to governments, and we're telling this to EU institutions constantly. And we come up every year, every quarter of a year, we come up with a quarterly report, and we were talking very critically about what's going on in each member state, in each EU country, in which they're not respecting human rights. And just let me give you some information on the key issues, because you also mentioned about hate speech. Hate speech, political hate speech against migrants. It's rising. It has been rising during the last years. We also have another problem, which is that we know incidents of racism and violence against migrants, mainly from police reports, NGOs, and media. Why? Because member states still don't collect information on hate crimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is also a problem. But it's also true, I mean, some member states do, but others don't.
Let me interject, if I may. How do you define hate crimes? Because this in itself becomes a bit of a controversy. Some people say, well, it's not a hate crime. You know, what is a hate crime?
Well, a hate crime is when you are
define
trying to, when it's a crime committed because of who you are, like because you are black.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why you are being targeted. Or because you are from an LGBT minority group, or you are Roma, or you name it. I mean, or because I'm a woman.
Yeah.
And just because I'm a woman, then I'm being targeted. These are hate crimes, and this is defined in the law. Now, I'm giving you different examples, but one thing that my agency does is we collect these findings from the victims, I mean, from the people who are suffering this. We do these huge surveys every year on different topics: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim crime, etc. And one thing keeps always been there, which is hate crime remains highly unreported. The victims themselves don't report it.
They're
and one
scared.
of the reasons...
A lot of them are scared, aren't they?
Yes, and the reason is, well, because of they are scared, or because they don't think that reporting is going to do anything.
Or that they have rights.
They don't, the most reason is, I mean, the highest reason among all the people that we have asked in our surveys: anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, because of being black in the EU, LGBTI, Roma communities. The main reason is, if I report it, nothing is going to happen. So why should I bother and report it? This is the main reason. There is also the reasons, like lack of awareness, which are my rights, lack of knowing where to go. But this is constantly everywhere. And for irregular migrants who are fearing about their situation, to even report this is an issue. But let me just go ahead and move on to other things which we have been actually saying, which is that there has been in the last years a situation, in particular in the last couple of years, in which the asylum laws and policies have been made more difficult and more tough in many EU member states. For example, in asylum procedures, more difficult than ever.
Yeah.
Detention of asylum applicants, also there. National restrictions on the right to family reunification. Well, before it was easier. This means that also other things, for example, the lowering of reception standards. Okay, so there is a restriction on social welfare benefits. This is affecting in particular children. So I can go on and on, and we do have actually, my agency has all this. Every quarter of a year we say, I mean, we were requested by the EU Commission to provide this information. We started doing it on a monthly basis in 2015, and then we moved on with that. And now it's every quarter of a year we are reporting and we're saying this is actually what needs to be done. And we come up with opinions, and we work here with the Greek government, for example, on how to better implement fundamental rights. And there is one key issue, and now that there is a huge amount of journalists here, that I wowould like to say, which is the fact that the population in Europe is highly misinformed about migration. Why do I say that? Well, 47%.
It's not just in Europe, by the way.
Yes, but I'm talking about what I know, which is the EU. So 47%, and these are figures from Eurostat, think that there are as many irregular migrants as regular ones in their country. This is the medium, yeah? In Greece, I think it's 53, 54%, or 57%. In southern and eastern European countries, almost half of the population. In other countries, in Western and more Scandinavian countries, is lower.
Okay, I want to involve both of you in a couple of questions here. First of all, and because the focus here is on how to cover the topic, you are a former journalist. You worked in broadcast. I think one of the biggest problems with NGOs and international organizations is they talk in legalese or jargon that most people do not understand. The layperson does not understand the jargon of the UN or the EU, or a lot of the stuff that comes out in lots of these press releases that are Chinese, excuse my French, okay? And it has to be simplified. Something has to, something has to be done about that. You have a big responsibility to make it easier for journalists, don't you think? And for Omoyele, I have a question for you. How do you make it easy for journalists to understand the big problem in Africa when you have countries that are Anglophone, that are Francophone, that were ex-Portuguese colonies, or, you know, and that have all the different local languages, etc.? How do you communicate with them? How do you provide a database that is useful for them through your work? So let's start with you.
I think it's first to humanize the stories.
Yeah.
And, you know, whether you're Anglophone, Francophone, or you are Lusophone out of Africa, the most important thing is that we're all human beings. And second is to understand context in which Africans understand these stories. And part of what we need to do for the media, and I'm sorry to say this, is for the media also not to think that, especially European and American media, not to think that when they are reporting things on Africa, they are doing Africans a favor. You know, because
what, sorry, I didn't hear.
Africans a favor, you know,
Yeah.
as if, you know, it's the same mentality of the EU, the UN, the US, that, you know, oh man, these Africans are just suffering. We are trying to help them, you know. And it is where context is important to understand, you know, that sometimes we need to visualize the data and the figures to understand that Africans contribute a lot more to some of your economies than you give to us in aid. But nobody knows. It's just like you said, you call your migrants, you call them expats, you give them paperwork. When we come to your country, you call us all kinds of names. You categorize us, you label us. If that context is not resolved within the reporting of news and stories about migration on the continent of Africa, within the historical context of where you are coming from, what we mean to you,
Exactly.
we are not going to be able to make it simple. You will just be creating one single narrative, which is this demeaning narrative that you're trying to help us, or you're trying to help Africa, or you're trying to help poor people. And that's dangerous.
Okay. Very briefly, Blanca, because I'd like to give the audience an opportunity, and we have 8 minutes and 44 seconds. So if you could answer that question I just asked you, and then we can maybe take a few questions if we have time.
So your question was about why public information in these institutions don't make it easier for journalists and for people in general.
Yeah, because I suffered when I put together my manual for journalists, reading through all the treaties and all the press releases and everything. It was just so much mumbo jumbo.
I know, and I totally agree with you, and this is my daily fight, and the problem is we write a press release that we believe is understandable. Like, I work in broadcast journalist, and for me, it's like, will my mother understand this? And if she doesn't understand it, then I rewrite it, and I make it simple. But the problem is that then there comes my lawyers, and I'm full with lawyers. So it's one public information officer against 25 lawyers on human rights, and they start changing every single word in every single paragraph.
Lawyers.
And then, yes, but then we are slow. Then we have to keep ourselves within the frames of the legal jargon. And then it becomes really difficult. And then I get these phone calls from journalists, because I was the spokesperson of the agency.
So you have to translate it to them,
And they ask me questions, and this is actually, maybe we can show a little bit there, my slide. It's just one, the first slide, and what we did was actually, and I would like people to know that yesterday I presented a toolkit actually on media, and it is actually made by journalists for journalists, in which, in the form of quizzes, we try to bring forward this terminology. We try to bring forward what it really means. We try to make the difference between what is a refugee, what is an asylum seeker,
There you go.
and
Good.
on all these questions and all these issues that are difficult to get. What is an unaccompanied children? When we talk about children, we talk anyone under the age of 18. This is what UNICEF says, and so on. Thank you.
I'm looking at the clock here. I'm very aware of these things, having worked for news agencies, deadlines. Okay, so very briefly, I don't think they have the slide there, but can we, if there is the slide, if there is Blanca's slide, we'll just show it. But let's take a couple of questions if we have time, because it takes time just to get the microphones around. Are there any questions from the audience? Could we have the house lights maybe? And if you do have a question, please state your name and what you do and who you represent, and to whom you're addressing that question, please. Could we have some house lights on, please?
My name is Azu.
Where are you?
I'm sitting right here, just
Here, there?
right across from
Hi,
you. Yes.
okay.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Azu Ishekwene. I am the editor-in-chief of the Interview magazine, and it's based in Nigeria. My question is to Shuure. I mean, I couldn't express any more eloquently than you did how the whole problem of migration is covered by the Western, largely by the Western, a large section of the Western press. My question has to do with coverage of migration by journalists in Africa themselves. I mean, do you think that there is sufficient filtering and understanding of the issues by African journalists covering events that have to do with migration in Africa as it affects Africans? Because often what you find is just a complete wholesale repeat of the news that we get about these migrants from the Western media, about Africans in Africa. So do you think there is sufficient understanding of the issues by African journalists themselves of the problems that we are faced with and what solutions we need to deal with them? Thank you.
Well, let me quickly say yes, there is, but the Africans must own their own narrative as well. Like you rightly said, most of the time what you hear about migrants are the same things that are written from the West, just repeated by most African journalists. And part of it is also for Africans to be introspective, to understand that some of the migration issues are also happening within African countries, like we did about South Africa. You know, for example, we don't like to admit it, but in 1983, Nigeria drove Ghanaians back with the little bags, what they call Ghana must go. You know, that is even more wicked than what Europeans do to Africans today. But what needs to happen is for more media in Africa to own their narrative about things that are happening about Africa, not to be afraid of it. And most importantly to Jen, to have more African journalists be keynote speakers at your events so that you can hear us out and know that we are covering our events as much as you are covering us as well, not just a one-way traffic in which you are always covering us and you don't even understand that we cover ourselves as well, better than sometimes most European and American journalists do.
Okay, thank you. Another question, maybe? Do we have?
Hello,
yes? Okay.
Peter Harrison, Arab News. Forgive me for asking you to repeat some of what you've spoken about before, but there's a lot of semantics, a lot of perception about words, and you both touched on the notion of expat versus economic migrant. Now, I live in Dubai. I'm British. I refer to myself as an expat. Other people refer to me as an expat. What you're suggesting is I'm an economic migrant. Is the perception, though, that an economic migrant is somebody who moves out of necessity? I was lucky enough that I got bored of living in England and then thought, well, stuff it, I'll get a job in Dubai. I got bored the other day, so I went and bought myself a nice bag. In people's minds, an economic migrant is not somebody who's so lucky. And finally, the migrant versus immigrant. I mean, I'm always having arguments with my newsroom about the notion of the term illegal immigrant. And I always say, nope, you can't be an illegal immigrant because in my understanding, to be an immigrant, you need to have signed papers, you need to have done documents. So, I don't know, I guess what I'm asking is, what about the perceptions? What about the semantics? What about any of it?
If I may answer that question, Peter, I strongly recommend you read my manual because it spells it all out. All the terminology is there. It's very easy to figure out, and it'll help you for better coverage. Okay?
And quickly,
we've got a minute 31.
Yes, let me just
go ahead.
quickly jump into that.
Please.
Dubai is a great example of what we're talking about. You are British, you're an expat. There's also a Nigerian that traveled the same way to Dubai the way you did. Is not referred to as an expat. Yeah. The person from Malaysia is not referred to as an expat. Exactly. You know, and this idea of calling people illegal immigrants is actually an English word, illegal immigrants. So you guys started it. And we need to start changing those languages. You need to change the vocabulary at the EU, in Britain, and in the US.
Sadly, if I just may interject here, sadly, there's an awful lot of racism and xenophobia attached to all of that. And we are in the land of the country that created the word xenophobia, from xenos, foreigner, the other, you know. I know some Greek. Go ahead, Blanca, you have a final word there.
Yes, just only to say that there is no human being who is illegal. The person could have entered a country in an irregular manner. But a person itself, a kid, a human being, is not an illegal person. So you can talk about the person being irregular, and I understand that for many people, and the use of words are crucial. And I'm not saying that in the EU they have chosen the right words. When the hotspots started and they were first put there, I was answering phone calls from journalists asking me what is exactly going on with the hotspots. And I had to be talking with my colleague from Frontex and ask her, how are you explaining what we're doing in the hotspots? Because Angela Merkel is describing hotspots as X, Macron is describing them as B, the Commission is describing them as C, and how the hell do I describe them now? And this was actually, so it took us all at that moment really like, what are the right words to use? And it took us time to think about it. So I'm not saying it's the fault of the journalists. I'm not saying, I do also think that there was a lot of fault from our side on how we did things. But I talk to Isabella Cooper every 3 days in Frontex. How are you answering these questions? How are we going to deal with it? Trying to, within ourselves, reach a consensus. And this was actually one of the things that I think was crucial.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Magda team, thank you so much. Really enjoyed that. There's so much of that I'm sure many of us can resonate. Now,